September 1945. Somewhere in western Germany. The convoy of canvas-covered trucks bumped over the cratered roads. Inside, Elise sat squeezed between 30 other women in the suffocating darkness. The air smelled of exhaust and unwashed wool. They had been told they were going to a rural work camp, a place of fields and potatoes. Elise clutched her small bundle of possessions, hoping for the quiet of the countryside. But then the trucks slowed down. The gears ground, shifting down. And through the gaps in the canvas, the light changed. It wasn't the green of the forest. It was the gray of stone and dust. The convoy stopped in a ruined town square. The engines cut out. Usually arrival meant shouting guards and barking dogs, but today there was a heavy, unnatural silence. Corporal Hayes, the American in charge, walked to the back of the truck. He hesitated before undoing the latch. He looked out at the square, wiping sweat from his forehead. He knew this was a bad idea. The town had been flattened by Allied bombers just months ago. The wounds were still open, and he was about to dump a load of German uniforms right into the center of the pain. "Everybody out. Keep your heads down." The canvas was thrown back. Elise blinked in the harsh afternoon light. As she climbed down, the scene hit her like a physical blow. They weren't in a farm. They were in a graveyard of buildings. The cathedral was a skeleton, its roof gone. The shops were piles of rubble, but it was the people that terrified her. Hundreds of civilians lined the streets. They weren't passing by, they were standing still, forming a gauntlet. Men on crutches, women in black mourning veils, children with old faces. They were waiting. The silence was louder than a scream. Elise's boots clicked on the cobblestones. The sound echoed. No one in the crowd spoke. No one moved. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence before the executioner drops the axe. Elise looked at the faces in the front row. She expected to see fear. Instead, she saw a cold, burning hatred. These people had lost everything. Their homes, their sons, their pride. And now the enemy was standing in their living room. The air crackled with static electricity. "Form a column, 2 by 2, Hayes ordered. His voice was too loud, too nervous. He gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles white. He realized there were only 6 American guards and 300 angry civilians. If the crowd decided to attack, there was nothing he could do. An old woman in the crowd stepped forward. She held a framed photograph of a soldier with a black ribbon on the corner. She held it up like a weapon, thrusting it towards Elise. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Elise looked down at her feet. She wanted to say, "I just worked in a telephone exchange. I didn't drop the bombs. I didn't start the war." But she knew it didn't matter. To this crowd, she wasn't a girl. She was the gray uniform. She was the symbol of the regime that had destroyed their world. The circle tightened. The first stone hadn't been thrown yet, but Elise could feel its weight in the air. "Forward, march," Hayes shouted. The column lurched forward. The sound of 30 pairs of boots hitting the cobblestones was the trigger. The silence shattered. It didn't start with a scream, but with a low, guttural growl that swept through the crowd. "Murderer! Murderers!" Someone hissed. Then another voice joined, louder. "Hurin! Whores!" Within seconds, the square erupted into a cacophony of screaming. The wall of civilians surged forward, narrowing the path until the prisoners were walking through a tunnel of angry faces. Then came the rain. It wasn't water. It was warm, sticky, and full of hate. A man on crutches spat first, hitting a woman in the front row. It was the signal. Suddenly, spit was flying from both sides of the street. It landed on their uniforms, their hair, their faces. Elise kept her head down, staring at the boots of the woman in front of her, trying to make herself invisible, but she could hear the wet sounds of impact around her. Hayes and the guards were overwhelmed. "Back, get back!" Hayes swung his rifle butt, trying to create space, but he couldn't shoot unarmed civilians. He couldn't shoot grandmothers. The mob knew this. They pressed closer, emboldened. They didn't hit the women with fists that would provoke the guards. They used the one weapon they had that couldn't be blocked, their contempt. They were turning the prisoners into objects of filth. Elise felt a warm wetness hit her cheek. She flinched, her hand instinctively rising to wipe it away. "Don't," whispered the woman next to her. "Don't react, that's what they want." Elise lowered her hand. The saliva slowly ran down her cheek like a tear. It burned. It was more painful than a slap. It stripped away her identity as a soldier, as a woman, leaving her just a target. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to put one foot in front of the other. The old woman with the photo was waiting. She had moved down the line. As Elise passed, the woman stepped out, bypassing a distracted guard. She didn't shout. She looked Elise dead in the eye, filled her cheeks, and spat directly into Elise's face. It was a massive, deliberate act. "For my Hans," the woman croaked. Elise stopped, stunned, the photo of the dead son filling her vision. "Keep moving." Hayes shoved Elise forward. He saw the exchange. He saw the spit dripping from Elise's eyelashes. He didn't offer a handkerchief. He couldn't show sympathy in front of this mob. He just pushed her. "Walk." Elise stumbled, gasping for air. The crowd cheered. They saw the fear. They saw the shame. And for a brief moment, their own grief felt a little lighter, because they had transferred it onto her. They reached the station, but there was no salvation. The march ended at the rail yard on the edge of town. The station building was a shell, roofless and scorched. But worse than the ruins was the empty track. There was no train. Corporal Hayes cursed, kicking a loose stone. "Where is it?" he muttered to his radio operator. They said 14. The prisoners were halted on the exposed platform. There was no shelter from the sun, and more importantly, no shelter from the eyes of the town. The saliva began to dry on Elise's skin. It was a sensation of pure filth. The spit that had hit her cheek and neck was now tightening as it dried in the afternoon heat. It flaked, turning white and crusty. She could smell it, the sour breath of strangers clinging to her own body. Every instinct screamed at her to scrub her face, to tear off her uniform and wash. But she stood still, hands at her sides. To wipe it off now would be to acknowledge the insult. The crowd hadn't left. They had followed the column, stopped by the station's perimeter fence. Hundreds of civilians stood gripping the wire mesh. They were like spectators at a zoo. They didn't scream anymore, they just watched. They watched the women standing in their filth. They watched them sweat. It was a silent, suffocating vigil of hate. The fence didn't protect the prisoners. It framed them. "Can we sit?" a woman whispered. Her legs were shaking. Hayes looked at them. He saw the spit on their clothes, the exhaustion in their posture. He wasn't a monster. He was just a tired soldier. "Yeah," he sighed, lowering his rifle. "Sit down, but stay in formation." The women sank to the concrete platform. Elise sat hugging her knees, burying her face in her arms to hide from the staring eyes at the fence. The concrete was hot, but hiding her face was a relief. A bottle of water landed near them. It was thrown over the fence. For a second, Elise thought it was a stone, but it was a glass bottle with a swing top, half full of clear water. The women stared at it. Was it poison? Was it a trap? Or was there, amidst the hundreds of haters, one person who remembered mercy? No one dared to touch it. It sat on the cracked pavement, glistening in the sun, an impossible object in a place of punishment. Then, a low rumble vibrated through the ground. Elise felt it through the soles of her boots. The rails began to hum. Far down the line, a plume of black smoke appeared against the gray sky. The train was coming. A collective breath was released. The train meant movement. It meant leaving this town, leaving these eyes, leaving this shame. Elise stood up, wiping the dried crust from her cheek with a violent, sudden motion. She was ready to go. The train screeched to a halt. It wasn't a passenger train. It was a line of wooden cattle cars, smelling of old manure and straw. But to Elise, it looked like a limousine. It had walls. It had darkness. It was a shield against the eyes of the mob. "Get in. Hurry," Corporal Hayes shouted, unlocking the sliding doors. The women scrambled up the high wooden sides, pulling each other in. They didn't care about the splintered wood or the filth on the floor. They just wanted to be inside. The crowd pressed against the fence, screaming. Seeing their targets escaping, the civilians grew louder. A stone hit the side of the train with a loud thud. Hayes watched the women pile in. He looked at the water bottle still lying on the platform. Then he looked at a fire bucket hanging on a post nearby, filled with stagnant water. He grabbed the bucket. Just as the last woman climbed in, he swung the bucket up into the car. "Clean yourselves up," Hayes muttered. He didn't wait for a thank you. He grabbed the heavy iron handle of the sliding door and slammed it shut. Bang! The world of screaming, spitting, and hating disappeared instantly. The car was plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by thin slats of sunlight coming through the wooden planks. The sudden silence inside the car was deafening. The roar of the crowd was muffled now, distant and harmless. They circled the bucket like it was holy water. It was dirty fire water, probably full of mosquito larvae. But it was wet. Elise dipped the hem of her uniform skirt into the bucket. She didn't drink. She brought the wet wool to her face. She scrubbed the dried, crusty saliva from her cheek until her skin was raw and red. Around her, 30 other women were doing the same, tearing strips from their undershirts, dipping them, and frantically wiping away the shame of the town. "Is it gone?" Elise asked the woman next to her. She turned her face to the sliver of light. The woman, an older nurse named Hannah, inspected Elise's cheek. The skin was angry and inflamed from the rough wool, but the white crust was gone. "It is gone," Hannah whispered. Then Hannah leaned forward. "Did I get it all?" She pointed to a spot in her own hair. Elise reached out with wet fingers and gently cleaned a speck of filth from Hannah's gray hair. The train jerked into motion. The wheels screeched against the rails. They were moving, away from the ruins, away from the spitting mob. They were still prisoners, still hungry, still defeated. But as they sat in the manure-scented dark, clean of the crowd's hate, they felt a strange sense of victory. They had reclaimed their faces. Hours passed. Night swallowed the train. The cattle car was suffocatingly hot. The water in the bucket was long gone, used to scrub faces and drink. Now thirst returned. The women sat in the straw, swaying with the rhythm of the tracks. Suddenly, the rhythm changed. The brakes screeched. The train slowed, then stopped completely. There was no station lights coming through the slats, only the darkness of a forest. A whisper ran through the car. "Executions happen in the woods." Elise felt her heart hammer against her ribs. The heavy door slid open with a groan. Cool night air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and apples. Corporal Hayes stood in the opening, silhouetted against the moonlight. He wasn't holding his rifle. He was holding a flashlight. He shined it into the car, blinding them momentarily. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "Engine trouble. We're stopped for an hour." The relief in the car was palpable. They weren't going to be shot, but they were still trapped. A movement in the tall grass caught Elise's eye. Beyond the tracks, someone was approaching, a civilian. Elise flinched, remembering the spitting mob from the town. Was this a partisan? Someone coming to finish what the town started? A figure stepped into the pool of light cast by the train. It was an old farmer, wearing muddy boots and a flat cap. He was carrying a heavy wicker basket. He walked right up to Hayes. "Weak da! Get away!" Hayes warned. He put a hand on his holster. The farmer didn't back down. He pointed to the open door of the cattle car, where 30 pairs of eyes watched him. "My daughter," the farmer said in broken English. "She is in Russia, prisoner. I hope someone gives her apple." He didn't ask for permission. He lifted the basket. It was filled to the brim with small, bruised, wind-fallen apples. Hayes looked at the farmer, then at the women. He remembered the hate in the town square. He remembered the old woman spitting. This was the same country, but a different man. Hayes took his hand off his gun. He stepped aside. "Make it quick," he muttered. The farmer nodded. He walked to the edge of the car and started tossing apples inside. "Catch," he whispered in German. "Eat, eat." Elise caught a small green apple. It was hard and sour, probably too tart for cider, but to her it was sweet as honey. She bit into it, the crunch echoing in the quiet car. Juice ran down her chin, not spit but sustenance. She looked at the farmer. He didn't smile. He just emptied his basket, nodded once to the women, and disappeared back into the darkness of his orchard. He hadn't said a word of politics. He had just fed the hungry. Dawn broke over the countryside. The train slowed to a final halt. The heavy wooden doors slid open, revealing not ruins, but green fields. They had arrived at the agricultural labor camp. The air smelled of dew and wet earth, cleansing the last lingering scent of the town's hate. Elise stepped down from the car. Her uniform was stained, but her face was clean. She took a deep breath. She had survived the gauntlet. Corporal Hayes signed the transfer papers. He handed the clipboard to the new camp commander. His job was done. He walked back towards his jeep. Before climbing in, he paused and looked back at the group of women. His eyes met Elise. There was no smile, no wave, just a silent nod of acknowledgement. He hadn't stopped the spitting, but he had given them the water. In war, sometimes that is the only difference between a monster and a man. Elise watched him drive away. She reached into her pocket and touched the core of the apple she had eaten in the dark. She felt the small, hard seeds. She didn't throw it away. She dug a small hole in the soft earth near the barracks and buried the seeds. It was a promise to herself. I will remember the farmer, not the mob. Years later, Elise walked in her orchard. She was an old woman, her face lined with the map of her history. She stopped by an old gnarled apple tree. She picked a fruit and polished it on her sleeve. Her granddaughter asked, "Grandma, why do you love these trees so much?" Elise smiled, biting into the tart fruit. "Because," she said, "they remind me that sweetness can grow even when the world spits on you." The spit washed off. The kindness took root. Elise never forgot the town square, but she refused to let it define her. She chose to be defined by the water in the bucket and the apple in the dark. If this story of human complexity moved you, please subscribe. Share this video to remember that even in the darkest times we have a choice of what to carry with us. Thank you for watching.